Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day three of the 2025 New Year New Language Summit. My name is Chris Brom. I'm the host and founder of New Year New Language. And in this session, I'm proud to present a good friend of the event, Steve Kaufmann. Steve Kaufmann is a Canadian polyglot and one of the co founders of Link. And on his popular YouTube channel, he's posted videos about language learning for more than 12 years. So he's quite an old school in the language learning community. In this session, we're talking about his language learning experience, past and present. And I also get him to talk a little bit about the future of language learning in terms of AI and how those tools are going to change not just language learning for the individuals, but also companies like Link who have been producing and offering language learning resources for many years. If you missed the first day's presentations, this is now too late to watch the replays with the free ticket. Sorry about that. But if you have the all access pass, you can always go back and watch anytime. And for more details on how to upgrade to that, just check the menu item above. And that's pretty much all for me for now. Check out the session with Steve, and I'll see you in the next one. And here I'm joined by the one and only Steve Kaufmann. Welcome back, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. We're all one and only, by the way.
Indeed. And it's been, as we were just chatting about, it's been 10 years since we first connected in this language learning universe or community or whatever you want to call this collection of people talking about language learning, making videos and podcasts and also events like this one. And I think my first question that I was curious about is how have you seen the development in terms of not just independent language learning, but maybe the whole industry? Because obviously you've been involved with Link for a number of years. You've learned languages yourself and you've connected with so many learners through all these conferences, and we had the NAPS events, and you've met so many people. So how have you seen the development, and what is your kind of crystal ball in terms of the future of language learning now with all this AI and tech and you know
Well, it's I go back right to when I first started getting involved, where there was a website called Anti-Moon. You remember Anti-Moon?
No.
Anyway, it was run, I think, by a Polish guy, by the way, who spoke English with an American accent. And you had to wait for like a few minutes before you could pick out that he wasn't American. Like he was quite amazing. And so that people were, sort of feeling their way into this idea that you can connect with language learners around the world. And I remember I posted a brief recording of me speaking Russian. I had just started learning Russian. And of course, I was totally roundly criticized. My accent was no good. This was no good. That was no good. So, but I'm not easily intimidated. So that was okay. Not a problem. But um, I think that the whole sort of community of language keeners, polyglots, not so polyglots, whatever, has matured. People don't jump on each other, don't try to, show how smart they are. They share the things they do that are useful. Um, and a lot of these can be different. Like I had a chat with Luca Lampoiello the other day, and he said that he was talking to Richard Simcott, and Richard said, Luca, your methods are wonderful, and I really appreciate hearing about them all, but I totally disagree. As if to make the point that we can all respect methods that different people use. And yet that doesn't mean we have to do what someone else does. There's undoubtedly a large body of things that are common to everyone. Major emphasis, no matter when you start speaking, like start from day one, like Benny, you still need a lot of input. Like there's no getting away from input. But around the fringes of that, there's so many different things. I think it's a lovely group. Whenever I've met in person, like in Bratislava or Montreal, you always feel you're amongst friends. People aren't judgmental. I think it's remained that way. It's grown. I think it's more, male and female now, whereas for a while, I think men were more likely to want to put themselves out there on the internet. And now we see more and more women doing that. I had an interview with Ijlal from Turkey, who is a wonderful polyglot, and she's quite young, I think early 20s. So yeah, it's expanded, and again, Turkey, so different countries getting involved. It had been, even though the Anglophones are notoriously poor at languages, somehow they were dominating the
Right.
polyglotosphere. And now we have people from all kinds of different countries, and more people offering language learning, videos on YouTube, and just a lot of stuff that's just continuing to explode, and in a sense explode traditional language learning. So traditionally, if you were either you went to school or you signed up for a course at the local library and you went there twice a week and that was it. And the teacher had the book and had all the smarts, and now it's just everywhere. So it's just continuing to mushroom. AI, I think we have to yet see how it fits in. We use it at Link. Where it's definitely useful is finding context appropriate translations for words. So if you look a word up in a dictionary and there could be 3 or 4 possible translations of that word, then the AI will help you find the one that's appropriate to that context. So that's really good. Things like asking ChatGPT to give you 10 or 15 examples of a certain pattern in a language, something that you're having trouble with. And of course, it spits it out right away.
Not
I'm
always
not
right,
yet.
but
No, absolutely not always right. But this is another thing. Like, I believe that to be a good language learner, you have to accept uncertainty, mistakes. So people sometimes go, oh, in Link, in your mini stories there in German, in the 3rd story, there's a mistake. We don't say that, we say this. It doesn't matter. Like, we should have so much input that we have to assume that some of it is going to be wrong.
right.
I mean, in languages itself, it's evolving. I would have went. Like, how many people now say I would have went instead? How many people say that? And one day that'll be standard. And there's lots of junk code and redundancy in language. So the fact that some of it is wrong doesn't bother me. There's lots. If they give you 10 examples, 9 will be right. 1 will be wrong. It's like if you say, give me an example of a subjunctive in French or something, 1 will be wrong. So that doesn't bother me. Yeah, we're looking at other things. I'm not into talking to AI. Like, I actually like talking to people. If I have a tutor in Turkish or in Persian, I want to see the person. I'm encouraged by the person. I want to interact with the person. Theoretically, see, because if you talk to AI and AI corrects you, I've never felt that being corrected was all that powerful. It's more the vast amount of exposure that you get that it gradually, develops certain, habits in the brain. Being corrected is not all that useful. And if you're very reliant, like, I'm going to get corrected and then I'll be speaking correctly. No, you won't. You'll make the same mistake again. So I don't see that as, but again, people want, I was thinking it would be fun, if I could genuinely speak to AI, say, like audio. So let's say that I was listening to something in Persian or Turkish, and then I said, I wanted, let's say, the 20 most common patterns of Turkish that show up in what I just listened to. And then I want to have a conversation with AI using these phrases. Then I jump in my car. I have to go somewhere. I'm half an hour. I'm in the car and I'm talking to AI using these phrases and using the vocabulary that came to something real, like a real person speaking. So that kind of thing would be on that basis in the car. That could be something. I think there will be more and more. We're certainly looking at it. At Link, we have an AI guy working for us now, and we're exploring the different things that we can do that use AI. But some people think AI is going to make it unnecessary to learn languages, which is I don't believe that for a second.
No. That
No.
it seems like there's more interest. It's kind of like a little bit of a, almost like the reverse effect. It seems like the more connected we become, the more there is a desire to kind of learn each other's cultures and languages. Like the more
Mm-hmm.
similar the countries become, the more it seems to matter, which is interesting because I always thought globalization was going to have the opposite effect of, the Tower of Babel and everything kind of becoming one. But it does,
Right.
to me, that doesn't seem to be, I haven't seen anything to indicate that that's the case. If anything, I see
No.
more interest in foreign language learning and just, admiration for other cultures.
I mean, I think it's part of increasing differentiation in everything. I mean, we used to have one brand. I don't know what it was like in Denmark. One brand of underwear, you know,
Right.
everything was like there was one brand. Now there's so many different brands, so many different restaurants, so many different everything. Whenever that's not the case, like when I was in Turkey wandering around the bazaar and all you see is Hugo Boss and
Yeah.
or a knockoff of Hugo Boss. So if the same brand takes over, that's not so good. But I think people want differentiation, and if people are confident that they can learn languages more easily, and they travel more easily, and they can connect by the internet more easily, and there's so much content available now.
Mm.
Podcasts like in Persian, the most fabulous podcasts in Persian, talking about like so I'm listening to this. I find this podcast in Persian on Spotify or wherever it gets suggested to me. And he's talking about multiculturalism and connecting it to the problems in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And like it's like the whole world, like it's a Persian guy, he's talking about the Balkans and he's talking, and I'm learning Persian and it's a whole new world. And I think people are going to learn more languages, not less, more.
Yeah, that's great. And do you see any problems with the kind of abundance of new apps and methods? And AI is obviously adding its own new library of that to where many people are getting a little bit lost in the choice now, whereas in the past you had maybe two, three well-known programs like Teach Yourself and Rosetta Stone and the Michelle Thomas maybe. But now, in
Right.
one Google search, you can find 1,000 different ways to learn Russian, and they all claim to have the unique method
Of
and,
course. Of course. But I still, when I start a new language, I find that teach yourself is very good. So I haven't it
right.
has its spot. I feel you still need to have a book that you keep, near the toilet or something. Like you want to have that, or before you go to bed. Like it's nice to have that book. And I find teach yourself is fairly good value, as long as you don't believe what they say on the cover that you're going to get to B2 with the teach yourself
Right.
book. You're not. You're going to get just a smattering, just a bit of a beginning. No, I think it is true. There's an abundance now of options, but in a way, it's a bit like learning languages itself. We are exposed to a lot. Uh, we also, though, have to suppress things that don't belong, that come from our own language or languages that we know. So we're constantly kind of pruning, right? So we're pruning in terms of the input that we get or things that we have in our memory from previous languages that want to keep popping up when you're trying to speak this other language and you keep on getting words of Korean in there or something. So you have to suppress that. You have to prune. And I think we have to prune. I mean, we're not going to try them all, these different languages, because we simply don't have the time.
Sure.
So yeah, but yeah, there's the Babels and there's the Duolingos and different people like different things or get hooked on different things and works for them. So that's fine.
As long as you can keep doing it and have fun with it, then that's half the battle.
I believe that you have to stay active with the language in some way. I always go back to what I heard at this one language conference. This lady was the head of the language department at San Diego State University or something in the States. And she said there's only three things that matter in language learning. Your attitude, the time you spend with the language, and your ability to notice what's happening in the language. And the
Mm.
key with spend time with the language means not listening to an explanation or reading an explanation in your own language about how the language works. No, no, no. It means
Mm.
reading or listening in the language. So as long as you keep doing something, you're not going to get worse. So you just have to push yourself to stay active.
Yeah. And do you think is that something that you try to just do the target language immersion, or do you at the beginning rely a little bit on English resources to get you started?
Well, necessarily, you can't get into a new language without using a language typically your own language, because
Right.
at the very least, you have to look a word up in the dictionary. And if you know, like all these people who push, monolingual dictionaries, I could never understand how that works. if you don't know the language, you need to have the word translated.
Well, I've heard of
So
classes like that in schools, even, well, probably mostly summer programs, but I've heard of classes that operate that way, and I don't really
with
know how
only
it
in the
works.
target, I don't know how it works. Very inefficient. Actually, it's very inefficient.
Yeah.
Uh, and of course, as I say if I were going to go after a new language, yeah, I don't mind a little explanation in English on how the language works. I have no illusions that I'm going to remember that I'm going to be able to apply it, but it's part of that introduction to the language. So yeah, you definitely, I prefer, let's put it this way, I prefer to get some help in a language that I know very well.
Yeah. It seems like the most effective use of time.
I would think so,
Uh,
yeah.
In terms of your own language learning over the years, you obviously been learning for many, many years. What are some of the ways that your language learning has kind of changed or adapted? Or was there some realization you made that you went, okay, I was wrong about this, and now I do it this way instead?
You know, fundamentally, it hasn't changed. So if I go back to French, when I sort of took this quantum leap from sitting in a classroom passively, where the teacher pushed whatever you're supposed to read this story and the 16 verbs that take être as an auxiliary verb and whatever we had in our classes, and still not being able to speak. So once I got very keen and I read a lot in the language and I watched French movies, La Nouvelle Vague, back in the 60s, so it was input, and long, long before I ever heard of Stephen Krashen. And when I studied Mandarin Chinese, it was the same. I mean, I read far more than any of my peer
Mm.
diplomats, language learners in Hong Kong. Massively, constantly at the bookstore looking for more books that had a word list behind each chapter, because there was no internet, right? So, and to look something up in a Chinese dictionary takes forever. And we know that whenever we look something up in a dictionary, we immediately forget whatever we saw, whatever the meaning was that was there. You've forgotten it. So, but it helps you get through the text you're reading, and eventually some things start to stick. So that's kind of always been pretty well always. What has changed is I was totally dependent on textbooks that had
Mm.
a glossary. And now, of course, you can find content on any language, anywhere on the internet. And if you can get at the digital text, then you can look the words up. So everything has become easier. And literally, you can Google podcast on Turkish cooking, and
Right.
you Google in Turkish, and you'll find it. So it's just that the idea that the teacher, and also if you don't understand Turkish verbs, you just Google Turkish verbs, or you Google this particular verb, and you'll find so many resources. So that the teacher, who used to be the teacher, told you what to read, teacher told you what to do, teacher was the source of wisdom on how the language works, because that was the teacher is teaching it. Nowadays, you don't need any of that. So that the teacher, I still like the idea of a tutor to encourage you, to help you, to guide you. And my Persian tutor at Link has either found so many wonderful resources or has created,
Mm.
26 episodes on the history of Iran in somewhat simplified Persian. So teacher, and she, of course, then I want to go back and show her that I understood and I can speak. And so teachers are important, but not as sort of the unique source of all wisdom and knowledge, or telling you what to do, kind of thing. So that has changed, but the fundamental issue is that you need a lot of input, and you need to speak whenever you get the chance, and need not to worry about how you sound. You just go for it whenever you have the chance.
Right. So would you say that's also the biggest, let's say, challenge that learners face is that they don't spend enough time really, just absorbing the language?
I don't know what other people do. uh, when for example, in Japan, these eikaiwa sessions where people sit around, or even in classrooms, the ESL classrooms, say in Canada for immigrants, whatever. Lots of sitting around and talking to each other with a very limited vocabulary, possibly role playing. I find all of that of minimal benefit. Now, a person has to have the discipline to read and listen a lot.
Mm.
So it's easier to go to a classroom. You don't have to do anything; just show up. Teacher says, "Do this." have a conversation about, imagine you're a checkout clerk in a supermarket or whatever they do, the role playing and
Sure.
stuff like that. No, I think if people realize that there's so much they can do on their own. Reading, obviously, where I think reading is the best for acquiring vocabulary. Listening, which triggers your curiosity because you don't fully understand what you're listening to, and it's easy to do. And so, yeah, I think many people understand it, but many people don't realize that there's a lot they can do on their own. And if they do all of that, then they come to the classroom in a better position to take advantage of this interaction with the teacher or interaction with others.
Right. And of course, Steve, you've been at the New Year New Language Summit before, where we talked about, you had a presentation one year about input, which is of course the big thing we're talking about here. So if people are interested in finding out more, there's that session. And I highly recommend also the other sessions that you did, which was direct Q&A from the audience. So
Okay.
there's more for people to unpack there. But for those who have tuned in and might not have too much experience, could you just quickly explain how to jump into that if you're not that good in the language? Because I think a lot of people might hear
Right.
you saying things like, "Oh, just listen to podcasts," as a good tool to use. But they'll be like, "Well, Steve, I don't understand anything of what they're saying. So how can I get to that point?" If you just a basic little
Sure.
catch up here for people who didn't see those presentations.
Okay, very, very good point. I mean, you cannot. So, we have the European framework, 6 levels. We could almost call them 3 levels. You're either beginner, you're
Right.
intermediate, or you're advanced. Okay. In that first period, you need a lot of repetition. You need to have things that are easier. So I typically use a starter book like Teach Yourself, which I like the best. But there's ASIMIL, there's Living Language, and many of these systems they promise you that you're going to go from beginner to B2, which is not going to happen. ASIMIL, which progresses very very quickly, but at the end of it, you're nowhere near B2, even though they put B2 on the cover of their books. You're not going to get to B2 because you need massive amounts of input. But so in that early period, that beginner period, you need a lot of repetition, which again is a fault with many of those beginner books. They don't give you enough repetition. That's why we developed the mini stories at Link, where each story there's a sort of we have two different point of view versions of the same story. In other words, the tense changes or the person changes,
Mm.
which affects the verb. Verbs are key. Like verbs are more important than nouns. You got to get the verbs if you want to say anything. And then we say, okay, George went to the store. Did George go to the store? No, he didn't go to the store. So you can have a question, you can have a positive or a negative response. And you're not required to remember anything because you're given the answer. You just have to, it's just exposure,
Mhm.
right? Exposure, same verb 5 times. And we have 60 of those stories. And depending on, say, the writing system, if it's Persian versus, say, Danish. So in Persian, the writing system is a real problem. So you might require 6 months on the mini stories. Danish, even though the spelling is quite obtuse, to say the least, still within 3 months, you're ready to move on and you're bored. So because in the initial period, all of a sudden you understand some things and you can say some things where you had zero knowledge. And so your tolerance for boring content is actually quite high.
Mm.
And at least mine is. And I can listen to the same story over and over and over again, hoping to understand what I continue not being able to understand. But there's that motivation. I want to understand that. I don't listen to the same, and this is what I recommend to people. Don't, like, if you're doing the mini stories, don't listen to the same, or if you're doing Teach Yourself or whatever, don't listen to the same story 15 times at one sitting. Do lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go back to lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Mm.
And because we track all of this at Link, I know that I will have listened to these stories 30, 40 times, each one of them, but not at one sitting because I 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so in the end, 30 times. So you're driving that, you're getting a sense of the patterns of the language and you're getting some vocabulary. Now you have to move out of that. You're in this safe space, lots of repetition. It's kind of comforting. You're starting to understand more and more. Now you've got to push yourself out. The podcast is still difficult. So
Mm.
there is that missing intermediate stage where the person, it's simply too difficult. Again, a link, I say if I have 10% unknown words or new words that I haven't seen before, that's easy because that will include names. Because statistically, the system doesn't know what's a name and what's a word.
Sure.
So if you're in that 10, 15% new word, that's where you're learning enough and yet it's not too difficult. But if it's 40% new words, it's just too difficult. So that intermediate stage is kind of the gap, but there are more and more people on the internet like Français Facile or whatever. I can't remember. Authentique, Français Authentique is one. There's all kinds of people out there putting out, and we try to do this as well at Link, sort of that intermediate range of stuff. One of the things that I did for Turkish was here, Chat GPT. I said to Chat GPT, what are the 10 most popular self-help books in 2023? So of course, Chat GPT spits out the 10 most, Atomic Habits or whatever it might be. So then I go to Chat GPT and I say, give me 1,000-word summary in Turkish of Atomic Habits. It spits it out right away. I import that into Link and I use it. So it's easy because, first of all, I've read Atomic Habits, but also most self-help books as content are easy. It's not literature, it's easy stuff. And concepts that we understand. And a lot of those self-help books, they say the same thing. All the different books, they say more or less the same thing. Get up in the morning, make your bed, eat healthy, exercise, set yourself goals. So it's easy. And so it's familiar. Familiar is easy. That's why sometimes if you're learning Korean, they give you, here's this tale from the 15th century when King so-and-so. It's so difficult because it's so unfamiliar. Whereas if you can have some content that's familiar with the vocabulary, that is not too difficult, that's the ideal sort of middle stage. And you'll need to do that for a while, but then it gets boring. So then you're ready to start struggling with the real stuff, the podcast. And podcasts are easier than, say, an audiobook and literature, because again, the guy's just talking like we're talking. So the vocabulary level is easier. Whereas if you're doing, I don't know, Kierkegaard or something in Danish, you're going to struggle.
Yeah. Dostoevsky and
So it's a matter
Russian.
of pacing yourself through this sort of initial stage, which can be 3 to 6 months, depending on the language. And then trying to find intermediate stuff. It could be a cooking channel on YouTube, because again, there's a lot of visuals. And at first learning the names of the vegetables and the fruits is difficult, but once you get that, they tend to repeat. And then you push yourself further. And again, if you can always follow things of interest, that's going to make, even then, if you're struggling, at least you're interested in the content.
Right.
So you
So
don't
if you're
mind. You don't mind the fact. Yeah.
Yeah, you're interested in self-help, for instance, you can talk about Atomic Habits in Turkish with other people because you've gone
Exactly.
through.
For sure. Yeah.
So that's a good idea.
Exactly.
And one of the big, let's say, uses of language learning is, of course, to travel. And I know you've been traveling actively for many years. What does the extra language learning do for you when you travel, and how much do you prepare for kind of each trip? Let's say you're going to a country that you haven't formally studied the language for too long before going.
In my experience, actually, you need a lot of preparation to take advantage of a trip to a foreign country. So I'll give you some examples. Okay, Vietnamese. I spent maybe 3, 4 weeks. I bought a bunch of books, as I always do. We didn't have Vietnamese link at that time. We do now. And boy, I crammed a whole bunch of stuff. Have you ever crammed for an exam and then next day is the test? And particularly like in France, we have these oral exams in France. When I was at Sciences Po, crammed one whole night. And the next day, the teacher asked me a question. I couldn't say a thing. Mind went blank. And I remember going to Vietnam, and the only thing I ever remember was ever able to use is the word for thank you, which is come on, because it's like English, come on.
Come on.
All
Yeah.
the rest of it was gone. Okay. I studied Croatian before going to Croatia. And despite the fact that I spoke other Slavic languages, I really couldn't use it at all. It's
Right.
very difficult, very difficult. Uh, Even Danish. And I was listening to audiobooks and understanding audiobooks and reading. It's so similar to Swedish, but first of all, the Danes all speak English so well. You really have to be lucky to find someone willing to humor you in Danish.
Right.
Uh, Not the case in Turkey, where, of course, a lot of people don't speak English. But even people who spoke English, they were so pleased that you were speaking Turkish that they humored me.
Mm.
So I had a number of conversations in Turkish, and everyone was kind of giggling and but encouraging. So the reaction you get is going to vary from country to country. In some countries, but by the same token, it's perfectly understandable. Like some people complain, "Oh, I went to Germany and I tried to speak German, and they wouldn't speak to me in German. They spoke to me in English." Yeah, but they're not obliged to speak to you
Yeah, I
in the
know.
language you're learning. Either they're busy or maybe they want to practice their English. You don't have a right
Exactly.
to impose your efforts at learn. They're not your teacher, So
Yeah.
yeah, so basically I feel for travel, but see, to me, it doesn't matter. See, preparing to go to Turkey, I did put so much effort into my Turkish and found audiobooks and ebooks on the history of Turkey and Central Asia. So that was part of my trip. That's part of my exploration of Turkey, of the Turkish world.
Mm.
Similarly with Danish, I read books on the history of Denmark. And so I had this understanding of Denmark through my trying to learn the language. Even if a store, someone in a store won't humor me in Danish, it doesn't
Right.
matter. It's a small part of the overall. Plus, I can hear Danish around me and I can understand. Even when I was in Turkey, I can read, I can understand. So even if I not always brilliant in my Turkish. So I think the way to look at it is if I'm going to go to country X and I'm going to prepare and try to learn the language, so then you're going to discover so many things about the language and the culture that will make your trip so much more valuable, so much more rewarding.
Mm.
And whether or not you're able to use it effectively all the time is to me minor.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good. I haven't heard that kind of point of view before because I was always thinking of the practical uses, and I think a lot of people
Yeah,
think like that. How much can I say in Danish or whatever when you get there? But really, you're right that a lot of the language learning is also to do with culture, and it's an opportunity to explore,
right.
just the history and the culture. So yeah, that's a nice perspective. So it's not about how good you get in the language, really. It's just a
Well, you're not going to get very good ahead of time unless it's a year otherwise, like a year,
right.
you
And you
know.
don't plan your holidays that far out.
Well, if I do, then like I did for Czech, I did for Romanian. Romanian is easy because 70% of the vocabulary is similar to Italian. So it depends on the language. It depends on the
Mm.
language. Depends on the language. And if you go to a country where they don't speak English, then obviously you're going to be using your language more. But the things that you need to say, like 2 beers, where's the bathroom? You can always say those in English. Like there's no
Sure.
necessity. But I think if you have some, at least if you get to a level where you're not, where you at least you feel you could defend yourself, say, which I think even if I got into real trouble in Croatia, I could figure it out. Not the
Okay.
case in Vietnam. Not the case. Like I hadn't a clue. Hadn't a clue.
Right.
So so
What
yeah.
about
But then
Denmark?
with Croatian, I had Czech and Russian and Ukrainian and other languages, so you can figure it out.
Yeah. And in Denmark, of course, you have a rich background with Swedish. Um,
In Denmark,
but
if I find a Dane who doesn't speak English, he'll understand Swedish. That's not a problem.
that's true. That's true. Yeah. It is tough and it is so cultural, isn't it? I don't think Danish or German people are impressed by you speaking their language anyway. They just
No.
think it's kind of funny, maybe a little bit. But other countries, you say one sentence and it's like you're their new best friend. So
Well, the Turks and the Persians here in Vancouver, if I go to a checkout girl, lady, whatever, at the supermarket, and I say salam, holisha machature, like they're just eating out of my hand. And the same is the
yeah.
case in Turkey. Um, but the most rewarding is, I mean, I make mistakes in German, but if I speak to someone in German, they're going to reply in German. If I'm in a store, ask a question in German, they're not going to reply in English. And occasionally in Denmark, I ask for something and it's a bit like Portugnol, right? My Danish is actually Swedish, like it's a
Yeah,
mixture of Swedish and Danish. But it works, right? It
they're
works.
used to it.
So,
A lot of Swedes working in
yeah,
Copenhagen, so
right.
Copenhagen Airport is about half Swedish, I think. It's hard to find a
Well,
Danish person
because
there.
of southern Sweden, they go in and out through to Copenhagen
Yeah, it's just the
with the
bridge
train
is
service and everything there. It's so
exactly.
good. Yeah.
Malmö is like 40 minutes away or something. So
Right.
there's so many people. A lot of Danish people live there too and work in Denmark. So I think that's slightly cheaper in taxes.
Yeah, and it's
Uh,
not just Skåne, it's also Småland. Like there's lots of areas, a fair population base that for whom Copenhagen is the hub, not Stockholm.
yeah, absolutely. And in the flights, if you ever take a flight from Copenhagen, it's going to be full of Scandinavians, And
Right.
I always thought it was funny. I recently took a flight on Norwegian Airlines from Copenhagen, and the cabin crew was Swedish. So it was kind of, welcome to Scandinavia, and the
Right.
messages played in Danish and English, so you had kind of a world tour, well, a Scandinavian tour there.
You
But
know,
an
it's
interesting dynamic, isn't it?
well, you know what's so interesting is largely through my Swedish and listening to Swedish, there's a guy called Herman Lindqvist, Swedish guy who popularizes Swedish history and narrates his own books. And it was a big part of my Swedish learning. And start to learn about the history of Scandinavia, the extent to which the Norwegians, but mostly the Swedes and the Danes, were massacring each other back in the
Oh yeah,
15th, 16th century. It's just awful. Like it's just awful. It's like, you know, ex-Yugoslavia on steroids.
it's true. Yeah,
It's just horrible. And now, of course, it's just one big happy family. Um, I mean, people don't realize, for example, that Norway was owned by, was part of Denmark for 600 years.
yeah. The Kalmar, yeah, they were all
And
run by Denmark at some point.
yeah,
But anyway, Steve, I always appreciate talking to you, and thank you so much for being part of the New Year New Language Summit again, and for
not
your
at all.
previous visits and also the podcast. I remember at the North American Polyglot Symposium, I talked a little bit about some of our first encounter on the podcast and how much that meant
Hmm.
to me. So I appreciate that. And I'm kind of moving towards removing myself from the language community and stepping down all these projects and working more on kind of my main job. So I just want to say thank you for the great memories and the good times over the years.
Well, I want to, echo these sentiments. And I think that we can all congratulate ourselves because language learning is a tremendous thing to do. It's good for your brain. It gets you in contact with other cultures, with other people. And a lot of people need to be pushed a little or encouraged or persuaded. And that's what we do in this community. That's what you've been doing. That's what I try to do. And if we can get even a small number of people to realize just how wonderful an experience it is and how doable it is, and that all you have to do is just put in the time and you will improve. And so to that extent, it's my third career being involved with this language community. I get a tremendous feeling of satisfaction and enjoyment being involved. And certainly our involvement over the years has been wonderful. So anytime.
Thank you so much, Steve. And for anyone who wants to know more, check out those previous presentations in the archives and check out Steve's YouTube channel. Steve, just type in Steve Kaufmann, it'll pop up there. And of course, check out Link. They're running a bit of a New Year's special, I'm told. So go
Right.
check that out
Yeah.
right now. It's in
Please.
the sidebar.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Chris.
There.
Okay.
Thank
Bye bye.
you.